For the past few years, I've been delving into the realm of the retro-inspired scene of shooters. Games that harken back to an old-school approach to game design where something was challenging but fun at the same time. Since the year 2016, we've been getting a plethora of these new retro-inspired games, making the old new once again. The term boomer shooter, though, is something that some people have had gripes with, and some have been confused with even. But the main effect behind it is that it is just a buzzword set by the existing trend of retro-inspired shooters harkening back from the 90s and the 2000s to distinguish a type of shooter apart from the mainstream titles that exist today. We have had some titles that have truly made their mark, going beyond the older sources of inspiration, blending them with other titles outside of the shooter realm, making for more interesting combinations. But the ties that bind them together are the graphics, where the retro aesthetic is completed in the visual representation. In the earlier days though of the indie scene, we would be flooded with 8-bit to 16-bit titles. Next would come the PS1, especially the PS1 horror-based games that you find on itch.io, where the technical limitations would be left behind and the visual surface would carry over with modernized controls. These particular choices are picked for a variety of reasons, but the most common one is relative convenience. High poly models are no joke to make. High poly environments take a tremendous amount of work, made by dozens of people even, creating 3D models of varying degrees. Less vertices and polygons make for less development time overall in comparison. You can get workable prototypes quickly and detail isn't as stressed over. I enjoy the aesthetic if I'm being honest, but at the same time it can become somewhat tiresome, where it makes me wish for more artistic variety even if the game is going to be retro inspired. There's only so many ways you can spin the PS1 style because of its limited low poly nature on top of the lower resolutions that they use for textures. There are many avenues, however, that can be reached while still keeping the retro elements from gameplay, mechanics, and overall design. PS1 is still great to emulate visually for nostalgic reasons, of course, but it's not the only way to bring out the retro feel, and you don't need to have an artist background either. So here's one game, Forgive Me Father. This was a game from the get-go that was up my alley. A Prohibition-era setting with Lovecraftian atmosphere and monsters to boot. Its soundtrack is pretty good, its gameplay is pretty standard for a retro-inspired shooter, but it's still enjoyable. But the eye-catcher for this game is in its visual representation. The sprites and the enemies and the weapons are given a 2.5D comic book representation with a good range of colors that flow from low to high contrast, filled with outlines to define them more clearly on the field. The presentation overall though is more akin to, like I said, a comic book. 2.5D works well in this case because sprites can still have depth if drawn and shaded correctly even in a 3D environment with 3D objects. Like in say Doom or Wolfenstein for instance, where those games are 2.5D. Cultic also makes great use of sprites while infusing voxels in the environment as well as some of the corpses and pickups. 3D application though is much trickier and requires a more complex mesh and shader system to get a more stylized comic book appearance. But if you're drawing in 2D, it is a bit easier while still being somewhat more time consuming in its own way. There's also a sequel game to it that looks to be an improvement and has a crispier version of the same comic book style that gives it its own identity. There are other games with similar comic book styles and each one will have its own personal touch. But Forgive Me Father is a good example to follow if your project is to be 2.5D or even just 3D. Other examples are Void Bastards and Explorator. The comic book style is one that is timeless because it relies more on creative artistry input rather than the technical capabilities that you would see in photorealistic games. Even in 50 years, games like this will still look good. Can't say the same for photorealistic games though. Going off the comic book spectrum, I have what I like to call 2000s inspired retro shooters. Sprawl is one such game that seems to be an amalgamation of games from the 90s and 2000s that the developer was inspired by, but the final product shows more of the 2000s visually speaking, where 3D tech was starting to make its way. We saw some huge strides in 2004 within the shooter genre thanks to games like Doom 3, Halo 2 and Half-Life 2, more so the latter. But some retro shooters as of late have been catching on to this time capsule and have allowed more polygons into their models and environments, producing something that's sort of in the middle, where it's not too high or low, but something you might have seen in 2004, or at least the best looking game in 2004. In the case of Sprawl, the textures have a degree of detail that makes it look better than a lot of the PS1 inspired retro games, but at the same time it looks dated, although that is on purpose. The 2000 centric graphics is something I'm more nostalgic about, where it showed the beginning of higher graphical fidelity past the PS1 era, and every year after has been more or less a continuation of that progressive march towards better graphics. Sprawl as a game is something that I enjoyed. It has good use of slow-mo mechanics and verticality thanks to the use of shotgun jumping and wall running that gives it a degree of parkour into the mix. But what drew me more to it was its blend of 2000 style graphics mixed into a world inspired by Ghost in the Shell and Hrot. But other games have also had a go at creating a similar early 3D look from the 2000s. Perilous Warp and Wretched are two other great examples. They have really good use of shadow and lighting work that's utilized in their respective atmospheres without putting too much detail into the models and environments themselves. To get the 2000s look overall, you want to look into the limitations set by PC games from between 2000 to 2004. The hardware limitations for 6th gen consoles add some more vertices into your model, but not too many. See this image here and the lines? You want to have something in between where there's not too many but not too little either. Textures should also be at the native resolution, but you can also play around with the numbers a little bit more if you want to inject a little more detail while still maintaining the early 2000s kind of look. Now when it comes to stylized 3D, sort of like what we already saw in the comic book style 2.5D kind of games, there are many ways to go about it in 3D, but one of the best examples I've seen so far is in Deadlink, a roguelite FPS that's like Doom Eternal but fused with roguelike mechanics. Its array of colors and rim lighting give it a really unique art style that makes it look crisp but detailed at the same time without too much reliance on traditional UV mapping to get every texture onto the model. In fact, with the right appropriation of rim lighting, dirt outlining and color ramping, you can make models without textures look amazingly good, or models with minimal use of textures look amazingly good. Just have a look at Reflex Arena for instance. It's one of the most visually impressive games, a game that goes for an untextured look. If I remember correctly, the game doesn't even have textures, but it does still keep a level of polish intact, and you can tell when you start playing it. Deadlink of course does have use of textures, but the amount of work put into their own master shader shows that they also had something special and unique on their hands, giving off a good blend of good color variation as well as good use of rim lighting in the mix. There's also a really good talk that the technical artist of the game did at the Digital Dragons conference. I'll put a link for that in the description for anyone that is interested in hearing it. Now when it comes to polygon counts, it doesn't matter too much here because this is more about applying a stylistic technique over your model that you can apply and keep in a timeless state. Just look at say Borderlands or Team Fortress 2. So much thought and consideration was put into them that even the first Borderlands can still hold its own visually, as well as Team Fortress 2, a game from 2007 that people still play today. Some other roguelite shooters like Roboquest and Battle Shapers have also taken the stylized 3D art style in their own unique way, and I think it's a great way to immortalize these type of games visually speaking. PS1 low poly aesthetics are great and all, but they are by design dated. These, however, are not. Ultimately, it does come down to preference. There are some amazing PS1 inspired games that go beyond the aesthetic and try to make a fun and unique game that stands out on its own, or even just use PS1 as like a filtering effect in games that have higher polygon counts. But it's not the only way to be retro artistically. There are dozens of styles that you can utilize just through different combinations of shading, or just different drawing techniques even. You can go from grease penciling to pixel art 3D to voxels, projected painting, literal outlining, mult rendering, you name it. The templates are vast, and with personal input and knowledge, you can have something that looks good and doesn't look old and dated. The indie scene as a whole started from, like I said, having a surge of 8-bit and 16-bit games, moving on to PS1, and now it's only natural that it moves on to other avenues. And when it comes to retro shooters, I would like to see more artistically impressive looking games rather than it just being low poly and calling it retro, whether it's 2D or 3D. They each have different methods at the end of the day. Each developer has their own styles and preferences. The more variety, the better. And stuff like the games I just presented is what I want to see more of. Thank you for watching.